Welcome to the May 2015 episode of RiskStudio. In this section, we discuss key risk management concepts with an expert speaker. And today's expert speaker is Alex Sidorenko, who will be speaking to us from Russia. He is the head of risk at RusNano, where he leads the risk management team at the largest private equity fund in Russia, specializing in high-tech and nanotechnology investments. He is responsible for ERM at the fund level and across its 97 portfolio companies. He has a very rich and global background in risk management. In the past, he has worked with PwC in Moscow, where he was involved with the complete rewrite of PwC's global risk management methodology. In 2012, he created Risk Academy, which specializes in risk education. In 2014, he was named the Risk Manager of the Year by the Russian Risk Management Association. He has also published a book titled Secret Recipe for Risk Managers. I was introduced to Alex recently through a LinkedIn discussion on topic of risk appetite. In this discussion, Alex's view was that risk appetite is not a useful concept for non-financial services firms, and it distracts risk managers and executives from other important risk management topics. I wanted to understand the reasons behind Alex's views, and hence invited him to share his views with me and the RiskStudio audience. And I'm glad that he kindly agreed. So welcome Alex to today's episode. Let me hand over the virtual stage to you.
Thank you, it's a pleasure. Hi everyone, my name is Alex Sidorenko and I'm really glad to be talking to RiskStudio today about the interesting topic of risk appetite.
Excellent. Okay, Alex. So risk appetite, there is a lot of discussions going on in lots of LinkedIn groups within the industry, and there are lots of different views and perspectives on this topic of risk appetite. So maybe we can start the session today by understanding, what your view is on this topic of risk appetite.
It's a very good question because I mean, if I can put it succinctly, my view on risk appetite is that it's way overrated. I think we've just been giving too much credit to this whole concept of risk appetite, and I think there are at least 3 reasons why I think it's overrated. First one, and again I have to do a little premise, everything I will say today is only applicable to the companies outside of financial services and insurance. There are, as we all know, there are 2 different worlds of risk management in financial services and outside of financial services. And even though we still use the same terms and definitions, they sometimes mean completely different things. So just be mindful before you decide to disagree with something I say, just be mindful that everything I do say only applicable to companies outside of financial services. So my first thought on why risk appetite I feel is way overrated is that, to be honest, the whole concept of risk appetite is not really applicable to the companies outside of financial services. It sort of struck me as a lightning bolt not so long ago, but for quite a long time I wondered, why do we continue talking about risk appetite for so long? Because it has been years, over 5 years, at every single risk management conference, every single risk management discussion or group meeting, there's always some talking about how to calculate risk appetite, what should be the set risk appetite for a particular industry or a particular company. I mean, surely if this topic was so important and so relevant, we would have come up with a solution. But yet, we seem to have come up with different partial solutions, but nobody has come up with that silver bullet that fits everybody's expectations. It raised a question in my mind. Why is that? Why do we spend so much time on the topic of risk appetite? Because if it was that important, surely we would have solved it already. Yet we haven't. So maybe the real answer is not that because it's super difficult and unique to every company and it's complex. Maybe the real answer is that maybe it's just not applicable. Maybe it's just not something we need to be spending our time talking about. And sort of going into details and understanding where the concept comes from, I begin to get a feeling that maybe it's just another fairy tale created by consultants and auditors. And for example, the most commonplace I meet a question regarding risk appetite or an expectation regarding a risk appetite is in the documents drafted by consultants and auditors, in their internal risk methodologies, in their guidance documents that they provide to different government agencies. So it was a little warning bell that made me think, well, is this really a concept that we need to be spending so much time on? So that was like the first little warning bell. The second point that to me is very critical is that maybe it's just not worth it trying to aggregate different risk types across the business to come up with some sort of single risk appetite statement, or what's even worse, and I mean, I've worked in 4 different countries, and the Russian Risk Management Society seems to have taken a very strange turn on the concept of risk appetite. Maybe it's not feasible, or maybe it's not even necessary to come up with some sort of aggregate risk value or risk number or risk exposure number. Maybe it's just not the right direction of thinking. And then the third point sort of again got me thinking about, well, what is risk appetite really applicable? And my internal feel is that it really isn't. It's not. Is that many significant risks are really not quantifiable or very poorly quantifiable. And for some reason, at least in the Russian Risk Management Society, when we talk about risk appetite, everybody's expecting some sort of value, some sort of number assigned to risk appetite to work with that. And I just think it's a wrong expectation set by the wrong people, and it's up to us to sort of stop the spreading of that wrong message across the different executives that are then requesting risk appetite statements to be provided, to be signed at the board level. And the final thing is, I'm coming to a conclusion that you don't really need risk appetite for all the different risks. You don't really need limits for all the risks or tolerances for all the risks. It's only the significant that need to be incorporated. So that's sort of my first thought on why risk appetite is overrated. I think it's overrated because we misunderstood, or sorry, we've lost in translation the transition of the concept from financial services to non-financial services. We kind of ignored that it's not applicable in the way it was meant in the financial services, and rather than stop and forget about it or stop and redesign it, we're trying to sort of fit a square peg in the round hole. And we've been doing it for years, which is, to me, is bizarre. So that's just one thing on why I think risk appetite is overrated. The second point, which I think is even more important, why risk appetite is overrated, is that every single company already has some definition of risk appetite anyway, and there are examples of it in virtually all the policy documents that are approved by the executive and the supervisory boards. Just think about it. Deal and approval limits that my company, for example, has, where certain deals have to go to the board of directors because they're above a certain limit. That's the risk appetite that they've set to the management, that they will allow management to sign on investment deals as long as they're below a certain limit and as long as they satisfy certain other criteria. The other facet or the other form of risk appetite is used by all the auditing companies. Every single auditor has their own level of significance or level of materiality, as we called it in Australia. And that's a risk appetite. That's the threshold or cutoff that they will judge something to be of significant value to the company or not. We also, during our risk assessments, we use risk criteria. Sometimes it's quite complex risk criteria. We try to measure each risk exposure in terms of the human impact, environmental impact, financial impact, reputational impact, legal and compliance impact, and as many other things as you may decide. That's all risk appetite at play as well. Most companies have key performance indicators. That's essentially setting the risk appetite as well. I mean, you have a goal or an objective that you need to achieve, and you need to take certain risks to achieve those objectives. And plus, the last thing, which every single company has, there are certain risk areas within the business that have zero tolerance. Health and safety, environmental impact, bribery, corruption, all those things, or product safety, all those things have inherently built-in zero risk tolerances, and that's risk appetite as well. So I mean, if we sort of go back to the theory side, risk appetite is either zero tolerance, qualitative or quantitative. We have all that already incorporated into business, and just like with most other risk management themes, this is like a constant battle. Do we create something aggregate, centralized, and call it a risk appetite statement, or do we just use different risk tolerances and different mechanisms like deal approval limits, like risk ranking criteria, like zero tolerances, or do we integrate it into every single business process and make it risk-based rather than bring it into a sort of aggregate corporate level? And to me, the answer is very simple. We shouldn't do it at the aggregate level. We should, as much as possible, integrate into the business. And for me, this is the biggest and the most important principle within the 31,000 risk management standard, which says you need to integrate risk management into business processes and decision making. And so that brings me to the third point why I think risk appetite is overrated, which we constantly forget about. Is that risk appetite is not mentioned in ISO 31000. Now, I'm told by one of the authors that the only reason why it's done is that because they couldn't agree on the definition because it translated differently in different languages. But you know what? Things always happen for a reason, and it's not there, and it's a good thing. And I'm just hoping we will forget about this whole risk appetite, because there are other things that we need to be focusing on. And particularly, I mean, if not no risk appetite, then what? And to me, the other sort of level, or the next level within this whole framework of risk appetite, or specifically risk tolerances or risk limits, they still apply, and they are very useful. And to me, that just means five key takeaways that I wanted to summarize before we sort of go to question and answer section of our discussion today. The five key takeaways for risk appetite. Once you sort of, first of all, you really need to force your brain to think that, to be a little bit more open-minded. Don't automatically reject what I'm saying. Just maybe allow yourself some space to think about it and consider that maybe that approach is more simple and more straightforward, and we shouldn't necessarily comply with everything our auditors tell us when they expect a risk appetite to be approved by the board of directors, because realistically, nobody apart from the auditors don't ask for that, and that concerns me a lot. I don't see any value in it. As a practicing risk manager of 12 years, I do not see a value in risk appetite. I do see value in different risk limits and risk limiting mechanisms built into decision making. So let me just wrap up my little discussion on the 5 key takeaways. The first takeaway is that every single risk is different, and it needs to have a different risk assessment methodology, risk measuring and risk exposure analysis methodology. That means that risk appetite for different risk limits, I should say, for different risks would be calculated, set up, measured differently. The second point is that risk tolerances and risk limits should only be set for the top risks. And that could be 2 or 3 things, depending on what's important to the company. Or it could be 5 things, depending on what's important to the company. Is it product safety and health and safety? Is it investment deals and exposure to a particular industry? Is it foreign exchange exposure that you don't want to increase above a certain limit? Risk appetite, or risk limits, I should say, should only be set for top risks. That's the second point I wanted to make today. The third one is the notion of overall company risk appetite is useful in one instance. It's useful not as a separate formal document, but it's useful as the discussion with the board of directors and the senior management, in a way that risk framework or the approach to management of risks should be aligned with the appetite for risks of the investors and the senior management. This means to me that the company may well have high risk appetite, and that's fine. If they have high risk appetite, they probably don't need to spend that much effort in managing risks, as long as they communicate their high risk appetite to all of the investors and they are open and transparent about that. Australian Stock Exchange spent a lot of effort in driving that message. As a listed company, you could have a high risk appetite, that's fine, but you need to make sure that your investors know that and they consider your high risk appetite when they invest in your company. On the other side, if the company has low appetite for risk or low tolerance to risk, that means they need a much more robust risk management. And since, at least in my experience, 99.9% of the companies that I've met actually don't want to admit to high risk appetite, then they should put proper effort into establishing good risk management practices. Now, the fourth point is that just like I don't think the company should have a separate risk framework document, I don't think the company should have a separate risk appetite statement. Rather than that, I think risk limits and risk limiting mechanisms should be built into existing policies. For example, zero tolerance for health and safety risks is already and has been always incorporated into the OHS policy. Product safety has always been, zero tolerance to product safety has always been incorporated as part of the product safety policy. Foreign exchange risk limits and investment deal limits, deal approval limits, should be incorporated into their investment practices policy or procedure or investment rules document that is approved by the board. Basically, what I'm saying is I don't think risk appetite should be a separate agenda item for the companies. It should be, however, a part of the existing documents that are already approved by the board. Now, that's a big thing, is because a majority of the risk managers that I have to interact with on a day-to-day basis, they still search for that silver bullet. They still want to come up with a separate risk appetite document. And unfortunately, that's what the audit companies expect from us as well, which I think is not right. I think the risk manager needs to take a stockpile of the different documents that are approved and annually reviewed at the board of directors and have a good think about whether the most significant risks that the company is facing that he can get from the risk assessment are covered within these documents, and if they're not, these documents should be updated, not a separate risk appetite statement should be created. And the final point is risk limits only make sense when they are integrated into decision making and performance management. Those are probably the two most important processes in a company. Risk limits make a lot of sense when they are considered and monitored before the decision is made. For example, do we invest in this company because it increases our exposure to a particular industry above our tolerance? Should we do that? Should we increase our tolerance because of the investment? Probably not. Probably we should reconsider or restructure that investment, or find other risk mitigating ways, like bringing in another investor. Should we purchase this equipment or do this leasing contract because it's in euros and that increases our foreign exchange exposure above our limit? We may, if we have inbuilt risk mitigation practices like hedging, for example, or maybe we shouldn't. That's the kind of things that need to be considered during the decision making. And same with performance management. This is where risk limits come up again, and they're quite useful, is at the end of the year or at the end of the period, when you measure somebody's performance, this is the revenue generated by a particular business unit. You also need to consider, well, have they stayed within their risk limits, or have they actually increased the exposure, and how is their performance compared to the risk exposure that they've created for the company? So those are the 5 probably key takeaways in terms of risk appetite. But just to summarize before we sort of go into the questions, I just want to really finally put to rest the concept of risk appetite, not use the phrase ever again. Continue thinking about different risk limits and different risk tolerances, because they apply not to the company as the whole, but rather they apply to specific risk types. There is a different risk limit and risk tolerance for every risk type within the company. And I also think it shouldn't be, just like with many other risk management practices, the classic risk management, what I call it. I'm a big believer in the soon end of classical risk management. I think we are sort of over risk assessments and we're over risk management frameworks. I think just like all the other classical, historically, risk map and risk registers and risk reports, I think separate risk appetite statements should be a matter of the past as well. I think rather than creating separate risk documents, we should be updating and changing existing policies and procedures to make sure risk messages and risk mechanisms are integrated into them. So that's sort of my my key takeaways on risk appetite, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions, and we can continue that communication in LinkedIn. My details are provided, but now I'm happy to answer the questions that you may have already.
Okay, thank you, Alex, for that quick overview of the concept of risk appetite, and then also your position on the importance, or not that important relevance in terms of risk appetite. So something I would like to start from a question perspective is you mentioned in the introduction that organizations are expecting that risk appetite means that they have to provide, sort of one number as part of the risk appetite, that the risk appetite of our organization is 2 billion, and then that 2 billion may represent credit risk, market risk, operational risk, lots of different risks. Is that what you have seen? Organizations are interpreting risk appetite as, provide me one big number for the organization?
Definitely. I mean, it's an interesting take on that, because this is at least what I've been seeing here in Russia over the last few years, is that risk managers, for some reason, continue that search for a holy grail search for a single number that would be defining a threshold within the company. For example, 2 or 4 billion. Anything above 4, any exposure above 4 billion is too much, and we need to take action. And for some reason, that's the number that they want to put in some sort of separate risk appetite statement, and they want that approved by the board of directors. The reality is that that number is impossible to get, because you can't really add together different risk exposures, different risk types, and what about zero risk tolerances? Not everything can be measured. And I just think that that search for a single number somehow became just a very weird fascination by some of the risk managers. And that's sort of what brought me thinking that maybe risk appetite shouldn't be applicable. Maybe we shouldn't be talking about a risk appetite as being some sort of single value for the business.
Okay. So the number is not necessarily the aggregation of the risk exposure of lots of different risks, because some risks, like you say, cannot be quantified financially. But the number you are referring to is more, sort of a very high level risk tolerance, where we are saying that, okay, we will not be losing 20% of our revenue, or more than, if any risk which may result in us losing 20% of our revenue, then that risk is unacceptable. So it's that sort of high level limit or tolerance is what you're referring to when you talk about this one number.
That's right. I mean, most commonly it's like 5% of earnings before interest and tax,
right,
as used as a benchmark.
Right.
But I mean, reality is, as the risk manager, I don't think that's the answer. I don't think there's any usefulness in having that number, and most of us have it anyway. We use it for our risk ranking criteria. In risk assessments, we use financial criteria, reputational, human, environmental, as I mentioned, compliance criteria, and financial criteria is just one of them. So it's kind of the confusion around this whole mystery of risk appetite. It's either something we all already have, because we all have that threshold, which is our line above which the risks are considered to be extreme and need to be brought to the attention of senior management and board of directors. It's either something we already have, so I don't understand why we continue talking about it, or it's something that it's impossible for us to have, which is an aggregate of all different risk types within the company, and we continue sort of running towards an impossible goal. So either way, I think the whole discussion about risk appetite is pretty outrageous.
Okay. So okay. If we don't if we don't use the term risk appetite, I'm trying to understand, what are the principles, that whoever is driving that discussion, whether it's the regulators, consultants, auditors, what are the principles, we're trying to achieve by implementing this concept. So the two I can think of is some sort of control. That risk appetite is some sort of a control. And if we take a scenario where, let's say, you are a big Russian oil company, and you are now expanding into UK, where you are then hiring new executives, new employees in that UK organization. So from a headquarter perspective, you want a level of control over that subsidiary, and so you want that subsidiary to know that which type of risks you are allowed to take, and which type of risks you're not allowed to take, and what the boundaries are in terms of how much risk you can take. Do you think that is sort of one of the principles of this concept, that it allows, when there are new executives who join the organization, that something like a risk appetite statement can at least give them a good start to understand, okay, what is allowed and not allowed in this organization, without having to talk to a lot of people and read a lot of document. Do you think that is one of the principles sort of behind this concept?
I'll try to break my answer into two parts. First, what you're talking about is exactly the principle of why we would have risk tolerances or risk limits. I mean, this is the control or the cutoff after which a certain decision has to be escalated to a level above, whether that be a headquarters or whether that be the board of directors or the supervisory board. That's basically the sole purpose of this instrument, is to give some sort of guidelines or structure for the decision making. It explains to every executive what kind of decisions and up to which level he can make on his own, and then which decisions need to be made at the different level above a particular executive. So to sort of my answer to your first part of the question is absolutely yes. That's exactly the principle. My answer to the second part of the question, I think this is where sort of the difference of my view is that no, I do not think there should be a separate risk appetite, because I think different limits should be incorporated into different procedure documents that the new executives need to be familiar with in any case. I just think it's a pretty weak argument that we need to create a separate risk appetite statement just to save the executives time to quickly understand, the rules of the game, what they can and cannot do. I actually think that's the wrong approach. I think the right approach is to set different limits for different risks and document those different limits in different documents. So, for example, in the human resources document, there should be limits set on certain position levels that they can hire without the headquarter approvals. In the drilling contracts and exploration contracts, there should be certain price caps that would limit the subsidiary's ability to make decisions without involving the head office. In health and safety policy, there should be a clear statement around what the company believes is appropriate health and safety, zero tolerance to exposure to human life, etc., etc. So while, it's not like one is right and the other one is wrong. Many different procedures with integrated risk mechanisms versus a single risk appetite statement. I don't think it's a question of whether one is right and the other one is wrong. I think it's more the question that you can do either. They both will work eventually. But I just think the more correct approach and more in line with the principles of 31,000, ISO 31,000, is having risk mechanisms integrated into many different documents. That's the only way you can instill the risk culture, because this is, at the end of the day, this is what it's all about. It's to create a culture within the company that will guide every decision that the executive makes. He makes certain decisions on his own because he has inherent risk culture, but certain decisions he escalates because that's the risk culture set within the company. So I hope that sort of clarifies a little bit my view on risk appetite statements.
Yeah, so I think that clarifies the control side. Yeah, that if you are a headquarter in Russia, you open an operation in UK, then you want the new team in the UK to be able to understand what risks you're allowed to take and not take. So maybe we address the second principle, which was around the communication. So which is where, if we take an example that a new member has joined the board, and now he needs to understand what is the risk appetite of this organization, that what risks this organization is willing to take, what risks this organization is not willing to take. Don't you think a one sort of risk appetite statement type document where you just provide high level details, right, that in terms of health and safety there is a statement, but it then references saying, okay, if you want to see more details, then you go to the health and safety policy. It then talks about foreign exchange, but at a very high level. But then, of course, the details can stay in the separate document. But do you think that new the board member could benefit if there was one document which at a high level, so it doesn't have all the details, we're not bringing in all the details in that one document. Do you think from that communication perspective, something like a risk appetite statement might be useful?
Hmm. It's an interesting take on that, and I mean I've got many conflicting messages in my mind right now. Well, first of all, um, I, I have been in a number of instances where I have a feeling that a new board member um, it will take months for the new board member to truly understand the risk appetite of the company,
Hmm.
and the appetite will change. Um, there's no, I mean, what you're saying sounds very reasonable in theory, but in real life, it works so much differently.
Hmm.
Is that the board will have a different risk appetite for every single issue. That's pretty much it. And oversimplifying it by creating a joint risk appetite statement, I think I think we passed that.
Hmm.
In terms of our risk management maturity, we kind of tried doing that even with the single risk framework document, but I think we've grown out of it. Because the way I see it is, I mean, if just imagine that the company does exactly what you propose and has a single risk appetite statement, I'm pretty confident that these risk appetite statements would look identical across different companies, because no company in their right mind would tell the new board member that they're not zero tolerance to corruption, health and safety, and some other environmental impacts.
Hmm.
No company would ever put in writing that no conflict of interest should exist and segregation of duties should be, and all those other things. Risk appetite, it's just like with many other risk management issues, it's quite intimate
Hmm.
to a company. And I mean, of course, you can put it into a single document and provide it to the board member, but it would be nothing more than just a high-level fairy tale statement, just like we have many other statements that are published in annual reports every year. So from being good in terms of corporate governance, maybe yes. In terms of real day-to-day business decisions, I think it has zero value. I think because risk appetite would be different for every different issue, it should be treated separately for every decision that the board members need to make. That's basically my take on that. I just feel that we don't really need to oversimplify this. The decision-making process for the board of directors is already a pretty well-established process, and rather than creating something of our own, we need to integrate into that existing process. That's sort of my take on that second part of your question.
Okay, and if I just sort of maybe extend, yeah, that oversimplification point, so I agree that, yeah, in terms of environment, health and safety, yeah, these the parts of the risk appetite statement may look very similar, but don't you think from a strategic perspective? So, for example, a board member may be sitting on the board of two organizations, and he may see in the statement that one organization has a very high appetite to grow via mergers and acquisition. So that's what the risk appetite says, while the risk appetite of the second organization says that we're not willing to take the risks of mergers and acquisition because we believe it's a very high risk strategy. We want to grow organically. That at least on how what sort of the thinking about the organization is in terms of the strategic risk, where there may be differences which may help this board member sort of understand okay, what sort of recommendation he should provide when he's in the board meeting for one organization, and then what sort of
Sure.
recommendations he should provide when he's on the board meeting of the second organization.
Yeah. I mean, fair question. I personally, and again, this is purely my view.
Mhm.
I feel I've been in risk management long enough to understand that all such things are not really sustainable.
Mhm.
Because first of all, um, the companies, the companies are no longer set in stone in terms of their strategic directions. I think, I mean, even if the company said they're not going to be moving towards mergers and acquisition because they view this as a high risk area, not for a second I believe that if a good opportunity arose, that they wouldn't do it. I think the companies are so agile right now that it would be untrue. It would be a lie to themselves. They would be deceiving themselves that they would be putting things like that in their risk appetite statements. So I actually, answering your question, actually no, I don't think that's even practically possible to do in a company setting. And even if they do, even if two different companies do say different things in their risk appetite, they would act depending on the circumstances, regardless of what it says in their risk appetite statement. And does that mean we need to be updating risk appetite statement every board meeting, depending on what the circumstances are? The crisis in the economy or the financial slowdown of Chinese economy, different things may completely shift the company strategy. So no, again, I think that's just oversimplifying things that unfortunately in real life, in practice, work completely different.
Okay, all right. So then let's move on to the next set of questions. So you were saying, so if we can stay, Alex, on that same slide. So I think I had a question on the limits. So limits for all risk are not needed, only the significant risk. So can you just maybe give us an example of what do you mean by limits? Are these sort of quantitative type limits, qualitative type limits, or could be a mixture of both?
Yeah. Well, when I talk about risk limits, I always see it in three different categories. It's either zero tolerance, qualitative, or quantitative. And different risks fall into different buckets. As I've numerously times mentioned today, health and safety, product safety, environmental could be in zero tolerance area. Sure. Qualitative could be things like client satisfaction or number one brand in the industry or something similar like that. And quantitative things are limits on exposure to a particular currency or number of faulty goods produced. Or as in our example is we have limits set on the deal size. Every deal that's above a certain limit in terms of billions of rubles, every deal has to be escalated and a different risk analysis methodology needs to be provided because it's a significant material investment deal.
Right.
So that's sort of what I mean by risk limits. And picking up on that last point, my approach historically has been that every business is exposed to a virtually limitless number of different risks. But really, we as the risk management professionals really need to be focusing on only the key ones. Having a rather small team for quite a large investment company with a lot of assets under management, I see it every day. I understand it very clearly that I have only a limited resource and capability that I can apply to management of risk. So I really need to prioritize my effort. And unfortunately, it's impossible to monitor, measure, and keep track of all the risks in the company. So my view on that is that risk managers and risk limits need to be set only for the most significant risks.
Yeah, and that's a very, very important point. Yeah, because I've seen where organizations, try and do this for hundreds and sometimes even thousands of risks. So in terms of significance, then what is the practice you've seen, Alex? That could be significant in terms of the actual exposure of the risk, or could the significance also mean the impact on the business objectives? That what have you seen from your experience on how organizations?
Well, the approach that we currently take in our company is we model, well, first of all, we've we've only narrowed down to 8 significant risks out of about 30 that we have for the business. And we model using at-risk and Monte Carlo simulations. We model the effect of each of these eight risks on the financial plan of the company, on the company liquidity, and on the 4 strategic objectives that we have defined in our strategy document that have been set by the government of Russian Federation for the company. And depending on the magnitude of the effect of these risks, the ones that are impacting the most significantly, they're the significant to us.
So, Alex, on this particular slide, which we have on the screen, can you explain that third bullet point where low tolerance to risk means more robust risk management? What do you mean by that?
It's actually an interesting thing that happened to us when we were drafting a risk management guide for the Australian Stock Exchange. This is the concept that we sort of come up with is the overall company risk appetite is not something only for the decisions to be made within the sort of between the management and the board of directors. It's also something that needs to be disclosed to the investors. For example, especially for listed companies, it's quite critical that investors understand the maybe speculative nature of certain gold mining companies that are listed on Australian Stock Exchange. They are super high risk appetite companies, and investors need to understand that if the gold is found, then the value of the company will increase 10, 15, 20 times. But if it's not, the company will probably liquidate and the investment made into that company will be lost. So we've actually came up with an interesting checklist, and this is probably the only place where I think risk appetite could be still interesting and applicable, is that the company and the board of directors and the management do need to have that discussion. Not how, but what's their appetite for risk in general, or maybe appetite to risk in different specific areas of business, depending on what key business processes are. And based on the answers to those questions, they really need to structure the risk management system accordingly. If, for example, the consensus is that we're government-based organizations, we have pension money invested in us, we have very low tolerance for risk because this is government money, we can't spend it unwisely, it has to be returned to the government to be paid to the pensioners in the future. That's an example of very low risk tolerance, and that means that if you have low tolerance for risk, that means you need to be very good at managing risk. You need to have good formal, structured, comprehensive risk management. And the opposite is also true. If you say that we're a gold mining company, our management team is only 5 people, we know that the success of the company and the value of the company depends solely on us finding gold in 3 different locations that we have acquired licenses for, we have a high tolerance for risk, then maybe, and we're transparent and open about that to our investors, then maybe the company doesn't need to have a robust, complex, and comprehensive risk management. Maybe they could have an informal risk management process because they've made it quite clear to everybody that their appetite for risk is super high. So that's what I meant by that point. It's good to have for the risk manager, and it doesn't have to be a formal survey or questionnaire. It could be just a discussion with the chair of the board of directors and the CEO of the company. If their appetite for risk, or maybe some of the key investors, if their appetite for risk is low, then they should provide proper support and resources for risk management. It can't sort of be both ways. You can't have low tolerance for risk and then do nothing about risk management. That's what I'm trying to sort of convey with that particular message.
Okay, thank you, Alex, for that answer. So let's try and then close this session. So some of the key takeaways I'm taking, Alex, from the session today is that organizations are already implementing the principles of risk appetite, and there doesn't necessarily need to be something new organizations have to do in terms of a new risk appetite framework, a new risk appetite statement, because organizations have already been implementing the principles of risk appetite, via various mechanisms you talked about. So you think this debate, is irrelevant, that we should, go back and focus on all the important aspects of risk management rather than spend a lot of time, discussing on this concept, which may never materialize in real life, or which may be very difficult to implement in real life. If you want to sort of give us any final comments, Alex, before we close the session.
Well, thank you for the opportunity. I mean, I love bringing my controversial views to the Risk Management Society. And if for some reason you feel a strong disagreement with what I've been saying, you have my LinkedIn contacts on the page in front of you. So do feel free to write me angry emails. I'm always happy about that. My final takeaway on this topic, as well as all the other topics in risk management, I think we're on the tipping point in the history of risk management where we hopefully, and I sincerely hope that we will move away from the concept of ERM, which is like a central aggregate risk management with a separate framework. I'm hoping that we will finally move away from that, move more towards an integrated risk management where you wouldn't have a framework document necessarily. You would actually have risk management sections or text relating to risk management in every single policy and procedure document that your company has. And this is what I've achieved in the company I worked with. We have risk messages. Sometimes it's 2 words, sometimes it's a sentence, sometimes it's a paragraph, sometimes it's a whole section or a 20-page attachment to a different policy or procedure. But I think this is the future of risk management. Risk management should be integrated, just like risk appetite mechanisms should be integrated into different existing policies and procedures, into business processes. I just feel that's the only way how we can truly embed the risk culture into business. We have to make people make their day-to-day business decisions in a more risk-based way, so to say. So that's probably my my final takeaway on today's discussion. I just want to thank you for the opportunity again to be able to present my view on a fascinating topic of risk appetite, because it's been around for so long and yet we still have no solution. So it must be something fascinating.
Okay, thank you, Alex, for coming and sharing your views. I think very informative, very good points for our practitioners and our listeners to consider, when they're internally discussing this topic of risk appetite. So thank you very much.
Thank you.